When Jayden King, a successful black businessman, is arrested without cause by police, it seems like another case of racial profiling. But when the officers discover his true identity, they're left speechless, and Jayden refuses to let the incident go. What starts as a humiliating experience ignites a movement for justice that sweeps through the city, putting Jayden at the forefront of a fight against a deeply flawed system. As he battles legal challenges, corruption, and public scrutiny, Jayden is determined to not only clear his name, but also transform the way policing is done. This powerful story of courage, resilience, and accountability will leave you on the edge of your seat. Join Jayden's journey as he faces down an unjust system and sparks a revolution for change. Watch now to see how one man's determination can shift an entire city. Listen to the story. The afternoon sun blazed over the busy intersection in downtown Chicago. Jayden King, a tall, well-dressed black man, stepped out of a sleek black sedan, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. His day had been filled with back-to-back meetings and boardroom negotiations, but now he was looking forward to a quiet dinner with his wife, Melinda. As he made his way across the street, heading towards his favorite restaurant, he felt eyes on him. Two police officers, standing near their cruiser, had noticed him. Jayden didn't think much of it at first. He had grown used to being scrutinized. Being a black man in America meant enduring side glances, clutching purses, and suspicious stares. But today felt different. Suddenly, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching fast. "Hey, stop right there," one of the officers shouted. Jayden turned around, confused. "Is there a problem, officers?" he asked calmly. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a robbery," one of the officers barked, already closing the distance between them. Jayden's brow furrowed. "I'm just heading to dinner. I haven't done anything wrong." But before he could say more, the officers grabbed his arms roughly and shoved him against the hood of their patrol car. They cuffed him with unnecessary force, ignoring his protests. "I told you, I'm not the person you're looking for," Jayden repeated, trying to keep his voice steady, though anger was bubbling inside him. Bystanders began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Jayden, feeling the cold metal bite into his wrists, glanced around at the crowd, faces filled with concern, disbelief, and pity. One officer pulled out his radio. "We've apprehended a suspect matching the description. Black male, early 30s, wearing a suit." "Are you kidding me?" Jayden muttered under his breath. "I'm not a criminal. You have the wrong person." But the officers were unmoved. They placed him in the back of the squad car and began running his information. Jayden sat in the back seat, his heart pounding, the weight of injustice heavy on his shoulders. His mind raced. How could this be happening? He was an accomplished man, a leader in his community, yet here he was, treated like a common criminal simply because of his skin color. After what felt like an eternity, the radio buzzed with a response. The officers listened intently before one of them froze, his eyes widening in shock. He turned to his partner, whispering something urgently. Jayden could see the sudden shift in their demeanor from the rearview mirror. The officer who had been so quick to arrest him opened the car door slowly, his face pale. "Mr. King," he stammered, his voice shaky. "We apologize. There's been a mistake." Jayden, still in handcuffs, stared at him, incredulous. "A mistake?" he repeated. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The other officer, visibly shaken, stepped forward, fumbling with the keys to unlock the cuffs. "Sir, we didn't realize. You're the CEO of King Enterprises." Jayden rubbed his wrists, his gaze icy. "Yes. I'm also a Harvard graduate and a philanthropist. But none of that should matter right now. You didn't arrest me because you thought I was a criminal. You arrested me because I'm a black man. Don't think I didn't notice the way you looked at me." The officers stammered out apologies, their voices barely audible. By now, the crowd had grown, and whispers of Jayden's identity spread like wildfire. Some people gasped, recognizing his name from headlines and TV interviews. Others shook their heads, knowing all too well that this could have been any black man, successful or not. Jayden looked at the officers with a calm that hid his rage. "You need to ask yourselves why you really stopped me. If I wasn't in a suit, if I didn't have a recognizable name, would you still be this apologetic?" The officers stood in silence, unable to meet his eyes. Jayden shook his head, disgusted. "This isn't over. I'm going to make sure you're held accountable. Not just for me, but for every black man who's been wrongly targeted, arrested, or worse." He turned and walked away, the crowd parting as he made his way back toward the restaurant. The weight of what had just happened lingered, but he refused to let it crush him. He would turn this into action, into change. The officers were left standing there, speechless, as the world watched their humiliation unfold. As Jayden walked away, the crowd's murmurs followed him, but he kept his focus straight ahead. His mind was racing, heart still pounding from the humiliation and fury that had surged through him moments ago. He wasn't just going to brush this off as another incident of racial profiling. This time, there had to be consequences. He entered the restaurant, a quiet buzz of activity filling the room. Melinda was already seated at a table, scrolling through her phone. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, but her smile quickly faded when she noticed his tense expression. "Jayden, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern as she stood to meet him. He took a deep breath, trying to regain composure. "Let's sit down first," he said, pulling out his chair. He explained the incident to her in low tones, careful not to let his voice rise in the hushed ambience of the restaurant. Melinda's expression shifted from concern to anger as the story unfolded. "They handcuffed you? For what? Walking while black?" she hissed, her hands clenching into fists on the table. "Pretty much," Jayden said, his voice calm, but the rage beneath it was unmistakable. "But they let me go when they realized I'm someone important." He spat the last words bitterly. "That's the problem. They shouldn't care who I am. No one should be treated like that." Melinda sighed deeply, her eyes clouded with frustration. "This isn't the first time, Jayden, but it has to be the last. You can't just let them get away with this." "I won't," Jayden replied, his voice firm. "They need to understand that this kind of behavior won't be swept under the rug anymore." He pulled out his phone and opened his email. He had connections, lots of them, but he didn't want to make this about him. He wanted to ensure that this incident sparked a bigger conversation, one that could lead to actual change. The next morning, Jayden was back in his office, pacing behind his desk as he made calls. First to his legal team, then to civil rights organizations. Within hours, news outlets had caught wind of the story. His arrest video, captured by a bystander, went viral on social media. #JusticeForJayden started trending, but Jayden knew this wasn't just about him. Later that afternoon, his office phone rang. It was the police commissioner, a man who had previously sat at the same table as Jayden during city charity events. "Jayden, we need to talk," the commissioner said, his voice carrying an undercurrent of desperation. Jayden leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing on his lips. "Oh, we'll talk, but not privately. This is going public." The commissioner was silent for a moment, then cleared his throat. "Look, we deeply regret what happened yesterday. The officers have been suspended pending an investigation. I'm willing to work with you to make this right." Jayden's smirk faded. "What happened yesterday isn't a mistake, Commissioner. It's a symptom of a much larger problem in this city and in this country. You can't just suspend a few officers and think that'll fix it. We need real reform." The commissioner sighed. "We can discuss reforms. Just let's keep it civil." Jayden's voice hardened. "Civil? I was arrested for no reason and publicly humiliated. Black men and women are treated like criminals just for existing. That's not civil, Commissioner. You and your department need to face that reality." The conversation ended on a tense note, but Jayden wasn't done. Over the next few weeks, he spoke at city council meetings, appeared on national news shows, and became the face of a new movement. The issue of racial profiling and police reform wasn't new, but Jayden's platform, his voice, and his relentless pursuit for justice breathed new life into it. He worked with civil rights organizations to push for legislation that would mandate body cameras, implicit bias training, and independent oversight of police misconduct. The movement grew larger than Jayden had ever anticipated, with protests across the city calling for systemic change. And the police officers who arrested him? They were fired after an internal investigation revealed a pattern of racial bias. But Jayden knew that wasn't the end. This fight was bigger than just a few officers. It was about dismantling a system built on discrimination and prejudice. Months later, Jayden stood on a stage in front of a packed crowd. His once private life had been thrust into the spotlight, but he didn't mind. This cause was worth it. He glanced out into the sea of faces, black, white, and every shade in between, all united for a common cause. "We are not just fighting for justice for one man," Jayden said into the microphone, his voice resonating with passion. "We are fighting for every person who has been treated as less than because of the color of their skin. This isn't about me. This is about us, about building a better, fairer system for everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, but Jayden wasn't done. He would never be done. The fight for justice was far from over, but now the world was listening. And that was more than he could have ever hoped for. As Jayden stepped down from the stage, Melinda was waiting for him, pride shining in her eyes. He took her hand, the weight of the past months lifting, just slightly. This was only the beginning. As Jayden and Melinda walked off the stage together, they were greeted by a wave of supporters and media flashing cameras and asking for comments. Jayden gave a few respectful nods, but pushed through the crowd toward a quieter spot. The energy from the rally still buzzed around them, but he needed a moment to breathe. "You did it, Jayden," Melinda said, squeezing his hand. "You're making real change." He smiled, but the weight of everything still hung heavy on him. "I know, but there's so much more to be done." Before Melinda could respond, Jayden's phone buzzed. It was a message from the mayor's office requesting a private meeting. He had been in contact with the mayor several times since the incident, but they had yet to sit down for a real conversation about the reforms he was pushing for. Jayden felt a mix of anticipation and skepticism. He had seen promises of change turn into empty political gestures too many times before. "I think it's time I hear what the mayor has to say," Jayden said, showing Melinda the message. "I'll go with you," she replied, her expression firm. "This fight isn't just yours." The next day, they arrived at City Hall, greeted by aides who ushered them into the mayor's office. Mayor Richardson was already seated behind his desk, his usual polished, professional demeanor intact. He stood up and extended his hand as they entered. "Jayden, Melinda, thank you for coming," the mayor said, his tone overly warm. "I want to apologize for what you went through, and I want to help make sure this never happens again." Jayden wasn't interested in pleasantries. He sat down, locking eyes with the mayor. "This isn't about an apology, Mayor Richardson. We need real action. No more lip service." The mayor nodded, but Jayden could see the unease flicker across his face. "I agree, and that's why I wanted to meet with you. I've been talking with our police chief, and we're drafting a plan to implement some of the reforms you've suggested. Body cameras, bias training, and an oversight board. We can start there." "Start there?" Jayden raised an eyebrow. "That's what you should have done years ago." "Those aren't solutions, Mayor. They're the bare minimum." "What about accountability? What about diversifying the force? What about reviewing past cases of racial profiling and wrongful arrests? If we're going to change this system, it needs to be from the ground up." The mayor hesitated, clearly not expecting the intensity of Jayden's demands. "These things take time, Jayden. The city has a budget, and there's only so much we can do right now." Jayden's jaw clenched, but he kept his composure. "Time is a luxury we don't have. People's lives are being destroyed by this system every single day. How much longer are we supposed to wait?" The mayor shifted in his seat. "I'm on your side, Jayden, but I need your help to make this happen. Let's work together. You have influence now. Use it to push this forward." Jayden narrowed his eyes. He knew the mayor was trying to play the political game, to co-opt his movement for a photo op. But he wasn't going to fall for it. "I'm not interested in playing politics, Mayor. I'm interested in results. If you're serious about this, you'll meet with the community leaders, activists, and legal experts we've been working with. You'll listen to their demands, not just mine." The mayor paused, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's schedule a meeting." Jayden stood, not wanting to drag the conversation out any longer than necessary. "We'll be in touch. But know this, if I don't see action, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who's responsible for the lack of change." As he and Melinda left the mayor's office, she looked at him with admiration. "You didn't let him off easy." Jayden shook his head. "He's just another politician trying to save face. If we don't hold them accountable, nothing will ever change." Outside City Hall, a group of reporters had gathered, hoping to get a statement. Jayden stopped and addressed them briefly. "We had a productive meeting with the mayor, but there's still a long way to go. Real reform takes more than promises, it takes action. I'll keep fighting until we see that action." As they walked away, Melinda turned to him. "What now?" "Now," Jayden said, "we push harder. We keep the pressure on. For good. This fight isn't just mine anymore. It belongs to the entire community. And we won't stop until things change for good. Over the following weeks, Jayden's movement gained more traction. Civil rights groups, activists, and community members rallied behind him, pushing for more extensive reforms. The city council began holding hearings, and public support grew louder by the day. And while Jayden continued to navigate the complicated world of politics, he never lost sight of why he started this fight: to ensure that no one, regardless of their race, background, or status, would ever experience what he had. His arrest had been the spark, but the fire for change was spreading, and Jayden King was determined to see it burn until justice was finally served. Eventually, the mayor and police department agreed to sweeping reforms, including an independent oversight board with real authority, increased training, and strict accountability measures. The movement that started with one unjust arrest had evolved into something larger: a demand for equality, for dignity, and for the protection of all citizens, regardless of race. Jayden stood once again before a crowd, this time outside City Hall, as the reforms were announced. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the sea of faces that had gathered. As he took the microphone, he glanced at Melinda, who gave him a nod of encouragement. "We're not done yet," Jayden said, his voice strong. "But today, we've taken a step forward. And with each step, we get closer to justice. This isn't just about me. This is about every single person who's been wronged by a system built to oppress. We will keep fighting. We will keep pushing. Because justice delayed is justice denied. And we won't be denied any longer." The crowd erupted into cheers, but Jayden remained grounded. He knew this was only the beginning of a long journey ahead. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hope that real, lasting change was possible. As Jayden stepped off the stage, the applause still ringing in the air, he felt an unfamiliar sense of both victory and responsibility weighing on him. Change had started, but he knew this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. The reforms were a step forward, but they were by no means the final destination. The crowd began to disperse, but many stayed behind, eager to speak with him, share their stories, and offer their continued support. Jayden listened to each person intently, their words further fueling his determination. A young man approached him, his eyes filled with a mix of admiration and pain. "Mr. King," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "what you did, it's inspiring. But what about all of us who don't have your platform? People like me, we don't get second chances. The system is still stacked against us." Jayden looked him in the eye and nodded solemnly. "I understand. This fight isn't just about the visible victories. It's about breaking down every barrier that holds people like you back. We're not stopping here. The system may be slow to change, but with enough pressure, it will break. And when it does, we'll be ready to rebuild it together." The young man nodded, gratitude and hope in his expression, and walked away. Jayden turned back to Melinda, who had been standing by his side, listening to every word. "You're becoming more than just a leader in this fight," she said softly. "People are starting to see you as a symbol of the change they've been waiting for." Jayden shook his head. "I'm not interested in being a symbol. I just want the work to get done." But deep down, he knew that this was part of the responsibility that came with his position. Whether he liked it or not, people were looking to him for more than just speeches. They were looking for leadership, for someone to keep pushing forward, to give them hope in a system that had long taken it away. As the evening settled into night, Jayden and Melinda drove home in silence, both reflecting on the magnitude of the day's events. The streets of Chicago blurred past them, and Jayden's mind began racing with the next steps. He knew that the mayor's agreement to reform wasn't enough. These changes needed to be implemented, enforced, and sustained. And to do that, the community needed to remain engaged and vigilant. As Jayden stood on the corner, watching the boy disappear into the evening, a gentle breeze carried a sense of renewal through the streets that had once seemed so suffocating to him. For the first time in months, he felt a sense of calm and purpose blending into one. His work wasn't over, far from it, but he had built the foundation. The rest would depend on how the movement grew beyond him. The following weeks brought both triumph and challenges. The reforms were officially in place, but the reality of enforcing them brought pushback from certain officers, and there were still cases of misconduct. The media was quick to highlight any resistance, painting a narrative that change was slow and painful. Jayden knew this would happen. Systems built over decades didn't crumble overnight. But what surprised him was the number of people, from everyday citizens to politicians, who were now standing up, speaking out, and demanding more. He had become something of a figurehead, whether he wanted it or not. His phone rang constantly, interviews, speaking engagements, offers from politicians asking for his support. But Jayden stayed focused on what mattered, pushing the reforms, ensuring that they didn't fade away under the weight of bureaucracy, and keeping the community engaged. He knew how easy it was for movements to fizzle out once the cameras left. One afternoon, Jayden was sitting at his desk, reviewing notes for an upcoming meeting with city council members, when his assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "He says it's urgent." Jayden looked up, his brow furrowed. "Did he say what it was about?" She shook her head. "No, but he seems desperate." Curiosity piqued, Jayden nodded. "Send him in." A few moments later, a man in his mid-50s entered the room, his face lined with worry. His clothes were worn, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his hat in front of him. Jayden motioned for him to sit down. "How can I help you?" Jayden asked, leaning forward, sensing the man's unease. The man took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto Jayden's with a mixture of hope and fear. "My name is Leonard Parker. My son, he was arrested last week. They say he assaulted an officer, but that's not true. He's never been in trouble, never done anything like that. They're holding him without bail, and I don't know what to do." Jayden's expression softened as he listened. Leonard's story wasn't new. He had heard countless versions of it in the months since his own arrest. The system, despite the reforms, still had deep cracks. People, particularly black men like Leonard's son, were still being swept up in those cracks, their lives upended by false accusations and a justice system that rarely worked in their favor. "I'm sorry you're going through this," Jayden said, his voice steady. "Tell me more about what happened. I'll see what I can do to help." Leonard's face brightened slightly as he explained the details. His son, Marcus, had been on his way home from work when he was stopped by two officers. The situation escalated quickly, and despite Marcus's protests of innocence, he was arrested and charged with assault. Leonard had tried to get a lawyer, but the costs were too high, and now his son was sitting in jail, awaiting trial. Jayden nodded thoughtfully as Leonard spoke, his mind already working through the steps he would take. He had connections with legal aid organizations and knew several lawyers who were passionate about justice reform. He could reach out to them, make sure Marcus had proper representation, and ensure that this case didn't get lost in the system. "I'm going to make some calls," Jayden said after Leonard finished. "I can't promise anything, but I'll do everything I can to help. You're not alone in this." Tears welled up in Leonard's eyes as he stood and shook Jayden's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." As Leonard left, Jayden sat back in his chair, the familiar weight of responsibility settling over him once again. He had always known that the reforms were just the beginning, that the real work would be in cases like Marcus's. Every person like Marcus, every family like Leonard's, represented the lives behind the statistics. And it was for them that Jayden would continue to fight, no matter how many obstacles came his way. Over the next few days, Jayden made good on his promise. He contacted a lawyer from the civil rights organization that had partnered with his movement, and soon, Marcus had legal representation. The lawyer, a sharp, dedicated woman named Tamika Reynolds, was relentless in her pursuit of justice for Marcus. She uncovered evidence that the arresting officers had used excessive force and fabricated parts of their report. Within weeks, the charges against Marcus were dropped, and he was released from jail. Leonard called Jayden the day Marcus walked free, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved my boy," he said. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Jayden replied. "This is why we're doing what we're doing, to make sure no one else goes through what Marcus did." Word of Marcus's release spread quickly through the community, and once again, Jayden found himself in the center of attention. But this time, it wasn't just about the movement or the reforms. It was about the individual lives being impacted. It was about families like Leonard's, who who now had hope where there had once been none. The weeks turned into months, and though there were still battles to be fought, Jayden felt a shift happening. The community was more engaged than ever before. People were holding the police accountable, attending city council meetings, and demanding transparency from their leaders. The reforms were taking root, slowly but surely. One evening, as Jayden and Melinda sat on their porch, watching the sunset, he felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the end of the fight, far from it. But for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to breathe. "You've done something incredible," Melinda said, her hand resting on his. "We've done something incredible," Jayden corrected, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jayden knew that there would always be more to do. The fight for justice was never-ending, and the system would continue to resist change. But now there was momentum. Now there was hope. And for Jayden King, that was enough to keep going. Enough to keep fighting. Because in the end, it wasn't just about one man's arrest. It was about every person who had ever been wronged, every voice that had been silenced. And Jayden had made a promise to himself and to them. He would never stop until justice was a reality for all. And he intended to keep that promise. When they arrived home, Jayden went straight to his office, pulling out a notebook filled with notes from previous meetings, strategies, and contacts. Melinda leaned against the doorway, watching him with a knowing smile. "You're not going to rest, are you?" she asked, her voice half amused, half concerned. Jayden looked up and smiled, tired but resolute. "There's too much to do. I can rest when this fight is over." Melinda shook her head gently, walking over to him. "It's never going to be over, Jayden. The fight for justice, it's ongoing. You can't carry it all on your shoulders." "I know," Jayden admitted, "but I can't sit back and do nothing either. Not when I know what's at stake." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'm with you, every step of the way. But you need to find balance. For us. For yourself." Jayden sighed, leaning back in his chair. She was right, of course. He had been so consumed with the movement, with the constant fight, that he hadn't stopped to take a breath. And as much as he hated to admit it, he couldn't do this alone. "I'll try," he said, offering her a soft smile. "But you know me." Melinda laughed lightly. "Yeah, I know. But just remember, even warriors need rest." Jayden nodded, closing his notebook for the night. He stood up and wrapped his arms around Melinda, pulling her close. "Thank you," he whispered, "for keeping me grounded." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Jayden found himself in more meetings than ever before. But this time, they weren't just with activists and community leaders. Representatives from the police department, city officials, and even national lawmakers began reaching out, wanting to learn more about the reforms Jayden and his team were pushing. The movement had grown beyond Chicago, and cities across the country were taking notice. But with that attention came more scrutiny. Critics began to emerge, some accusing Jayden of grandstanding, others questioning the feasibility of the reforms he was advocating for. The media began to dig deeper into his past, looking for any misstep they could exploit. Jayden had expected this. It was part of the territory when you became a public figure. But it still weighed on him, especially as the pressure mounted. One morning, as he sat in his office reviewing the latest round of news articles, his phone rang. It was his lawyer. "Jayden, we need to talk," she said, her tone serious. "What's going on?" he asked, already sensing that this wasn't good news. "There's a lawsuit being filed against the city by several officers, claiming that the reforms you're pushing for are discriminatory against police." Jayden sighed, rubbing his temples. "Of course they are. This could complicate things," his lawyer continued. "If this lawsuit gains traction, it could stall the implementation of the reforms. We need to be prepared." Jayden leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had known this wouldn't be easy, but now, the opposition was coming from within the system itself. The very people who were supposed to serve and protect were now fighting back against the changes that could hold them accountable. "We'll fight it," Jayden said firmly. "We're not backing down." The days that followed were tense. The lawsuit gained media attention, and suddenly the narrative shifted. Jayden found himself having to defend the movement on multiple fronts, both from the lawsuit and from critics who argued that the reforms were too radical. But through it all, the community stood behind him. Protests continued, rallies were held, and more voices joined the call for change. Jayden remained steadfast, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. And as he looked out over the city one evening, the skyline illuminated against the darkening sky, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The fight for justice wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, oppressed, or ignored. And he wasn't going to stop until the system, flawed and corrupt as it was finally held accountable. No matter how long it took, no matter how hard it got, Jayden King was ready. This was his battle, and he would see it through to the end. The movement was alive, and so was the hope for a better future. The lawsuit dragged on for months, becoming a high-profile legal battle that attracted national attention. The police union had rallied its members, claiming that the reforms Jayden and his team were advocating for were unfair and would undermine their ability to do their jobs. News outlets picked up the story, and debates raged across television screens and social media. Jayden found himself constantly in the spotlight, defending the reforms in interviews, speaking at town halls, and working closely with his legal team to prepare for court. The pressure was immense, but it only strengthened his resolve. He knew what was at stake. If they lost this fight, it would send a message that meaningful reform was impossible. As the trial date approached, Jayden's days grew longer, and the weight of the movement began to take a toll on him. He barely slept, his mind constantly racing with strategies, interviews, and counterarguments. But he wasn't alone. Melinda was always there, reminding him to take breaks, to eat, to breathe. "You're going to burn out if you keep going like this," she warned him one night as they sat on the couch, the flickering glow of the television casting shadows across the room. "I can't stop," Jayden replied, his voice weary. "If we lose this, everything we've fought for could unravel." Melinda placed a hand on his arm. "I know, but you need to take care of yourself, too. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion." He sighed, leaning his head back against the couch. "You're right, but it's hard to stop when it feels like the whole world is watching." "That's because they are," she said with a small smile. "But they're not just watching, they're with you. You've already made an impact, Jayden. Don't forget that." He nodded, appreciating her words, but the anxiety still gnawed at him. The lawsuit was a looming shadow, and despite his confidence, there was always the chance that things could go wrong. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was packed, with reporters lining the back and supporters filling the benches. Jayden sat beside his lawyer, his heart pounding in his chest as the proceedings began. The police union's attorneys argued that the reforms were discriminatory, that they would place undue burdens on officers and limit their ability to enforce the law. Jayden's legal team countered with statistics and testimony from experts, showing that the reforms were necessary to address the systemic racial biases that had long plagued the department. They argued that holding officers accountable wasn't a burden, it was a responsibility. As the trial went on, it became clear that this case wasn't just about the reforms anymore. It was about something much larger, a reckoning with the way law enforcement operated in America and whether the system could truly change. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the trial came to a close. Jayden sat in the courtroom, his hands clenched together as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The room was silent, the tension palpable. "The court finds that the reforms proposed by Mr. King and his team are lawful and necessary," the judge declared, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The city of Chicago will implement these reforms, and the lawsuit brought forth by the police union is hereby dismissed." A wave of relief washed over Jayden. He had won. They had won. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Jayden could feel the weight lifting from his shoulders. Melinda, who had been sitting behind him, leaned forward and wrapped her arms around him, tears of joy in her eyes. As they walked out of the courthouse, the press swarmed around them, microphones shoved in Jayden's face as reporters fired off questions. "Mr. King, how does it feel to have won this monumental case? What's next for your movement? Do you think these reforms will spread to other cities?" Jayden held up his hands to quiet the crowd. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "This isn't just a victory for me or for the people of Chicago," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This is a victory for every community that has been crying out for justice, for every person who has been unfairly treated, and for every family that has been torn apart by a broken system. These reforms are just the beginning. We have a long road ahead, but today, we've proven that change is possible. The crowd erupted into cheers, and Jayden allowed himself a rare moment of pride. But even as he smiled, he knew that this fight was far from over. In the days that followed, the implementation of the reforms began in earnest. The police department underwent significant changes, from the introduction of body cameras to the creation of an independent oversight board that had the power to investigate allegations of misconduct. Bias training became mandatory, and officers were held to a higher standard of accountability. But the changes weren't met without resistance. Some officers quit in protest, while others dragged their feet, refusing to fully embrace the new system. Jayden continued to meet with city officials, community leaders, and police representatives, pushing to ensure that the reforms weren't just symbolic. They had to be enforced and maintained. One evening, months after the trial, Jayden found himself walking through the neighborhood where he had grown up. The streets were quieter now, but the memories of his childhood flooded back. He had always dreamed of making a difference, but he never imagined that his life would take this path. As he stood at the corner where he used to play basketball with his friends, a young boy approached him. "Are you Mr. King?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. Jayden smiled. "Yeah, that's me." The boy grinned. "My mom says you're a hero. She said you're helping to make things better for people like us." Jayden crouched down to the boy's level, his heart swelling with emotion. "I'm just doing my part, but you can make things better, too. It's up to all of us." The boy nodded, his face serious. "I want to help people, too, just like you." Jayden patted him on the shoulder. "You will. I believe in you." As the boy ran off, Jayden stood up, watching him disappear down the street. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much to do. But for the first time, Jayden allowed himself to believe that real change was possible. And not just for him, but for the generations that would follow. The road ahead would be long, but Jayden King was ready for it. He had started something bigger than himself, and he knew that the movement would continue to grow, fueled by the people who believed in justice, equality, and the power of change. And as long as he had breath in his body, Jayden would keep fighting for a better future, for everyone. Hey everyone! If you found value in this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or questions. I read every one of them. And make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Let's keep this conversation going. Your voice matters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.